Hey, Professor Carrot in the Bio Bunker. Last time we talked about exponential growth. Today we're going to talk about population ecology again, the last lecture on that, and we're going to talk about logistic growth. So how a population might grow based on its demographics. And this is going to depend on biotic factors such as how fast an organism can reproduce, how many offspring they have, and abiotic factors like food availability and climate. Now, there's a thing we have not yet introduced called carrying capacity. And this is a theoretical idea that there's a certain number of individuals that a habitat can support. So the number of humans the planet can support is a certain amount. Okay? The number of squirrels that the UCA campus can support is a certain amount, and that is called carrying capacity. If an organism exceeds that number, then they're going to run out of food, or run out of space, or they're going to be stressed, or they're going to spread disease really easily, and that's going to make their numbers go back down. So that's what carrying capacity is, and the symbol for it is K. Okay, K for carrying capacity. Now, when the population exceeds that number, it will fall back below. Now, it can go above that for a brief period, but it will come crashing back down, and it will come back to carrying capacity, or it will fall below carrying capacity. And this creates what we call the logistic growth model. So before we saw the exponential growth model, which is a J-shaped curve, now we're going to have an S-shaped curve in the logistic growth model. So this is another theoretical way that a population might change. And what happens here is, unlike in logistic growth, in exponential growth, which had a constant increase in the same rate of increase every unit of time. In this model, we have a change in the rate of increase based on time. Why would it do that? Well, once again, biotic and abiotic factors. As we get more crowded, we get more stress, so we have fewer babies. As we get more crowded, we eat more food, so there's less food to go around. We have fewer babies. We spread disease more easier, more of us die. That's going to cause a change in the growth curve. Okay, so here's an example. A unicorn population is in a limited environment, meaning food or space or whatever is limited. The carrying capacity for the environment is 2,000 unicorns. Show how the population would grow in a 15-year period. This looks a lot like the example I used in the last slide, or the last lecture. So this is something I want you to try to do yourself. Okay, so for example, in year 1, there are 10 unicorns. And we're going to say that R is 1 again. Okay, so the amount of increase per unicorn is 1 unicorn. So R of 1. So R, the symbol over there on the equation, is 1. And K is 2,000. Okay. So here's how you set up the formula to figure out what the population growth might look like from one generation to the next. Okay, you would take, first of all, R times the population size. 1 times what is our population? We're starting once again with 10 unicorns. Okay, so 1 times 10. So that's going to be 10, right? And then you multiply that by the carrying capacity minus the sample size divided by carrying capacity plus the population size. So let me say that again in case I said it wrong. The carrying capacity minus the population size divided by carrying capacity plus the population size. Okay, that's what that second part of the formula is right here. So I have an example at the bottom. To figure this out, so year 1 we have 10. What would we have in year 2? Well, you take 10 times, so in parentheses, 2,000 minus 10 divided by 2,000 plus 10. Okay, 2,000 minus 10 divided by 2,000 plus 10. So what that's going to do is give you an idea of how many unicorns you'll have in the second year. Here's what you get for year 1 and year 2. So year 1, we have 10, okay? In year 2, we have 19.95. Remember, in the last example, it came out as 20. This is essentially 20. It rounds to 20. So you can round up. That's fine. It rounds to 20. So there's really no difference here in the number of unicorns in this logistic model for the second year. There's no difference from the example we did in the previous video with the exponential growth model. 20 unicorns in year 2. But how many in year 3? How many in year 4? How many in year 5? So here's what I want you to figure out. When would the population reach carrying capacity? See if you can answer that question before you move on. So pause the video and see if you can figure out when carrying capacity would be reached for this population. All right, so here's an example of the numbers worked out. In year 1, we had 10. In year 2, we had basically 20. In year 3, we had basically 40. And we can see the increase in unicorns as we go. And in year 13, well, basically in year 12, we hit carrying capacity. And then after that, notice you cannot exceed carrying capacity. You stay at 2,000 unicorns at that point. Now, in reality, you probably wouldn't maintain exactly that number. You would have 2010 one year, and then several would die, and you'd have 1,500 the next year. And it might come back up to 2,000, 2010, or whatever, and go up and down around that number. But when we data, this is what it looks like. This is known as an S-shaped curve. Now, once again, you have to use your imagination to see the S, but it's pretty much shaped like this. So notice, the first part here, right there, that is logistic growth, just like we saw before. But then after we reach carrying capacity, whoop, it levels off, it plateaus, because we cannot exceed carrying capacity. There's not enough food or resources to exceed that number. So carrying capacity is reached for that species. So we can see the two models side by side. Exponential growth in a case of population with unlimited resources, and a case of logistic growth where resources are limited with a carrying capacity, in this case, in this example, of 1,500. So what is going to limit population size? Well, there are density-dependent effects. So as population density increases, birth rates tend to go down or mortality rates go back up. It's a type of negative feedback. It's essentially homeostasis. What kind of things are going to be density-dependent? Competition for food and shelter, competition for resources, predation, competition for mates might also have some effect here. Accumulation of toxins in the environment. As these unicorns are eating and pooping and stuff in the same area where they eat, they might pick up more diseases. Stress is another one. Just being in a crowded area and just being stressed all the time might mean you have fewer babies. Might be able to hear my kid yelling back there. Now, there are density independent factors as well, which I'll mention in a moment. Here's an example then of how one population's growth might influence another population. This is a cycle of predator-prey relationships. Notice we have gazelles and lions. Some years gazelles have a spike in population. Notice what happens. A year later, or several months later, approximately a year later, the lions have a spike in population. Why? Because they were well fed. Then the gazelle population crashes. Why? They were eaten by the lions. Then lion population and gazelle populations both drop because there's not as many gazelles to feed the lions. They reproduce. Boom, they have a spike. Now notice the lions can't spike at the same time as the gazelles because the gazelles have to exist in order for the lions to eat them. Then the lions eat the gazelles. They have a lot more babies that year. A lot more gazelles get eaten, and then the population crashes. So real population dynamics are often up to carrying capacity and back down again. Like the carrying capacity changes because the more predators there are, the lower the carrying capacity, right? So you can see that in this graph. Here's an example of density-dependent factors on the number of young sheep produced by lambs, the number of lambs produced by young sheep, I should say. Notice that as the population size increases, the number of sheep producing lambs drops to like 20%. So as the population size increases, fewer mamas are having babies. Why? Probably stress. There's too many resources being used up. There's too much competition. There's fewer babies being born. That's going to limit population growth at that point. It's basically a form of negative feedback. As population size increases, the rate of births decrease and slow down that rate. Now, density independent factors also affect population growth. And those are going to be things like catastrophes, like ice ages, asteroid impacts. It doesn't matter if there's 20 of you per hectare or 1 million of you per hectare, an asteroid is going to affect you the same way. Okay, it's going to change how many critters the population can support. Climate change is going to affect organisms regardless of population density. it doesn't matter how many polar bears there are per acre in the Arctic if it's all melted. They're all dead anyway. So it doesn't matter how dense the population is. So these are factors that can affect a population. These are the things that a population ecologist would investigate. In the next lecture, then, we're going to move from populations to look at how different populations interact in what we would call community ecology, the study of communities interacting. Then we're going to go from there and to zoom out a little further. We're going to look at how minerals and things cycle through the biosphere and talk a bit about human impacts on the globe. And that will be the end of the course. All right. I will see you in the next video.